Hey, everybody. This is Aaron Harris, host of the Football Odyssey, and today I want to talk to you about Anchor. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. First of all, it's free, and there are creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone and computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and many more. And you can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. So go and download the free Anchor app or go to Anchor FM to get started. You are listening to the Football Odyssey. I'm your host, Aaron Harris, and today we will be discussing Gridiron Spies with Kevin Bryant, a 20-year Army veteran who just published his first book called Spies on the Sidelines, The High-Stakes World of NFL Espionage. A fascinating book that looks at how NFL teams use intelligence gathering methods to gain a competitive edge on their opponents. I think we have a fun conversation for you today that will pique your interest in the book and perhaps make you want to buy the book. I've posted a link to Kevin's website in the event you want to make the purchase. And as always, if you enjoyed the conversation and the show, feel free to subscribe, share, leave a review, and follow us on social media. With that said, I now bring you my conversation with Kevin Bryant. When I started the show 2 years ago, I never anticipated that I would have someone from the Department of Defense on the show, but luckily for me, we do have you on now because your book, Spies on the Sideline, The High-Stakes World of NFL Espionage, has recently been published. Before we get to your background into the Department of Defense, was publishing a book something that's always been on your bucket list?
Yeah, it has been for a very long time. As a matter of fact, writing a nonfiction book was not my goal originally when I was writing. Really, I wanted to write a fictional book and tried that, went that route, and crashed and burned completely. um, started. I gave it up. I gave up writing probably for 5-6 years, and I knocked out a couple of master's degrees and had to write a thesis for one of them. And when I was writing the thesis, I was like, this is really good product. And I actually found myself enjoying the research end of it, enjoying the writing of the thesis. And I thought, maybe I'm just better at writing nonfiction than I am fiction. And so once I had knocked out that master's, I was like, okay, and I finally found the subject of this book that I wanted to write on. I decided what the heck, I'll give it a shot. Man, I'm a glutton for punishment. Let's try round two.
Was the fiction book same territory as Spies on the Sideline?
Not at all. And I've kind of entertained writing a fictional book on this subject. I think you could probably crank out a pretty interesting story about spying in football and all that kind of stuff. But no, it was actually just it was a fantasy book, completely unrelated. I'm a fantasy nerd when it comes to reading books. I love Robert Jordan, Brandon Sanderson, but I just learned what that's probably not my forte as an author. So.
Yeah, I think this would be an interesting book to get from like a fictional standpoint because there's so many different ways you could go from it. Because I actually got really interested in this topic whenever I first heard about the Operation Handholding during the AFL NFL war. And then you and I had talked when we first connected about Dan Moldea's interference, and the book to me had sounded like a on the field equivalent of interference with the clandestine measures that teams will take to gain a competitive edge. But whenever you read, you see that there's definitely a fine line between illicit and legal spying on that teams resort to get that competitive edge. And it kind of felt like as I was going along, like if Paul Zimmerman were to have written a book about scouting and a topic like this. So for me, it was a pleasant surprise learning about how everything had encompassed into these measures. But I'm curious, if you were to look at this from a fictional standpoint, what particular instance would you want to cover?
Oh man. Well, I'd really like to get into, because I think one of the things I get into in Spies on the Sidelines is how many championship games have been affected by the collection efforts that teams use, whether those be permissible techniques like, just film study. I think the Broncos versus the Panthers Super Bowl is a great example of that. With Wade Phillips really figuring out Cam Newton and how to defeat the Panthers offense with him. And, so going through that, and then, obviously there's all these different illicit techniques that I talk about in my book that have also been used in lots of championship games. And so I think it'd be really neat to just kind of write a book about, let's say, fictionally it's a team that's kind of like, the Patriots or so, and you get to the championship game, they're going to try collecting on you. So what do you do about it? What can you do to fool them and kind of, pull the wool over their eyes, make them think one thing while you're going another way completely? How do you do that misdirection well enough to be able to trick them? Because that's the thing. Whenever you collect information, you try to figure out what a team's going to do in advance. You open yourself up. It's great if you can do it, but you open yourself up to the possibility of being fooled, which has happened by many teams in the NFL have done this in the past and pulled it off successfully. So I think that'd be a really interesting subject to be able to go into.
Yeah, sort of like the week leading up to a Super Bowl and focusing from that one vantage point of how they're going to deflect.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah. Yep.
Now, you come from an intelligence background, right, with the Department of Defense?
Yeah, so I work for the Department of Defense. I come from a background. I've collected and protected information for the Department of Defense for 23 years now, and spent 13 years as a special agent. So I've got a lot of experience in this field. I've got a master's degree in sports management and intelligence studies. So it's I'm writing about a topic I know a bit about.
What brought you to the DoD and specifically intel work? Was your family member? Did you have a family member involved before, or was it just something that always fascinated you?
Just the DoD in particular. My dad was in the Navy, so I really, I had that background. If you would have asked me growing up if I was ever going to be in the military, I would have said, heck no. Absolutely. But, I think we all kind of revert to our parents at some point, right?
Sure.
We see, I'm never going to be like them. And then you end up, just like them, which, my dad's a great guy. So I don't have any problems with that. I guess, sense of adventure, wanted to do something, wanted an interesting job, wanted to travel the world, see some stuff. And being with the Army certainly has afforded me all of those opportunities. Got to see lots of places I want and lots of places I didn't, but that's part of the job.
What was number one on the list of places you wanted to see?
Oh man, I've been to so many places. So I've lived in Germany for 7 years total, between 2 stints over there. So if it's in Western Europe, I've seen it. Was lucky enough to get to go to Turkey a couple times. Got to go to Istanbul, which was, incredible city, amazing to see. Prague in Czech Republic was one of my favorite destinations. But we've been camping in Luxembourg. Been on a cruise through the Baltic, tons of fun. Lots of places I still love to see, but I've been very, very blessed and fortunate to be able to see a ton of Europe. Been really neat.
Now, what about your background as a football fan? Were you always interested in the game? Did you play?
Yeah, so I'm a whopping 5'5" 3/4. I know because my wife just measured my height when she was measuring my daughter the other day. So and I weigh like $135 soaking wet. So football is not my sport as a player. I loved playing backyard ball growing up. I'm a soccer player. I'm a quick, speedy little guy. So when it comes to backdoor games, I think I'm all that. Right. But as soon as you start tackling, I don't want any part of that. So, I grew up a football fan. My, probably about 6th grade was about when I started getting the football fever. My dad was a big Seahawks fan, and I was watching a game, Seahawks Broncos, and I saw Elway just tear up the Seahawks. And after that, I was like, whoa, I like that team. I like Elway. This is cool. And, probably just to be a punk, despite my dad, I had to, cheer for the other team and, but ever since then, I've been a big Broncos fan.
Well, now it's funny that Russell Wilson now comes over to the Broncos, so it's kind of like the two generations colliding.
Yeah, it's been really the Broncos have been super fortunate in landing great quarterbacks. Elway, Manning, and now Russell Wilson. It's a pretty storied group of players there, and yeah, it's kind of cool that Russell Wilson came over. Right, it's kind of the merger of Broncos and Seahawks. As a matter of fact, I need to talk to my dad about that. He'll probably listen to this anyway. So, Dad, you need to think about becoming a Broncos fan now that we got, Seattle's like main dude.
Now, for a lot of the authors that I've interviewed are also heavy readers, specifically with football books. So what are some of your favorite books on your football bookshelf?
Oh my gosh. So I've got I read like 60 books researching this one. So, man, there's so many good ones. I'm looking up because I'm looking at all my books I got sitting up here. Yeah, you mentioned Dan Moldea, his interference book. I would say that one is probably right at the top of my list because what that goes into is everything to deal with NFL security, which I think is just a fascinating topic.
Sure.
Everything about how they deal with trying to make sure that players, coaches, managers, etc., aren't betting on games, how they go about protecting players, just how they go about protecting the shield and their image. And then, he gets into it much like my book, Spies on the Sidelines, does as well. When it came to all things Patriots, whether it's Spygate or Deflategate, just how the bottom line is the NFL's business and they want to protect their image. And it's, that comes at a bit of a price at times, right? And it's not always what's the most ethical or the best thing for, the fans. It can be, hey, how do we resolve this issue quietly or quickly? Which I think Dan Moldea went into really well in his book, and I also hammer home that point I think in Spies on the Sidelines.
Yeah, that was a book that really blew me away whenever I first read it because you really learn about how the security force isn't just people who are there on game day to make sure that nothing catastrophic happens, right? Like it's very investigative, and sometimes it acts as sort of like the private intelligence arm of the owners. A lot of times it's making sure following players to make sure that nothing will happen when they go out and about at bars or any sort of circumstance that could really put the team's image in harm's way. So that was something when I first read, I was like, wow, this guy really uncovered a whole new universe underneath the image that I had no idea, or maybe I knew existed, but didn't give much thought to how elaborate it really was.
Right. Yeah, precisely. Yeah, it's really interesting because those NFL security guys, for the most part, they're former law enforcement and very heavily former FBI agents. So, they've got a wealth of experience and they've got all those ties to all the police departments and whatnot. So whenever there's an issue, they can tap into those connections that they have and try to resolve all these problems really quietly,
Right.
and really quickly. And which, it makes sense. It's smart from the NFL's aspect. It, perhaps a little, shady, but let's face it, that's how big business operates. And that's not just the NFL thing. That's big business at large.
Yeah, I was going to say any Fortune 500 company probably follows the same playbook.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So from your point of view, you have obviously covered similar territory in terms of the clandestine behavior at the team level and at the NFL level. What was it like for you to try to get people to cooperate into doing an interview for a book like this? Because you mentioned in the preface how some people might not want to speak because it could do some harm to the team's legacy or even some harm to their own legacy. So what was it like, first of all, going about finding the people that would actually want to do this and then convincing them to do an interview if there was any hesitation?
Yeah, it was like trying to convince people to get a free root canal. Uh,
Yeah.
it was tough. It was tough. Um, So, there's a number of factors that play into that. So, first of all, if teams have information on how they operate, whether it's how they collect information or how they protect information for their team, those are trade secrets, right? Those providing that information can potentially compromise their techniques and tactics that they use, and could have a negative effect on their ability to gather that information and ultimately win games. So a lot of the time, what you're looking at is trying to interview former, NFL coaches or NFL, members of an NFL staff. But even that's very difficult because these guys don't want to tarnish any images of a team, of a coach. They don't want to taint a legacy, and they especially don't want to talk about people that are still working in the league, because even if it's somebody they don't really like or don't really care about, it's still someone whose paycheck and whose livelihood comes down to their job with the NFL.
Sure.
So it was very difficult. The interviews that I did get were all anonymous. No one wants to provide that openly. And frankly, I was a first-time author writing about a very sensitive subject and requesting interviews of people that were sometimes millionaires. All right. So it's a big ask.
Yeah.
It was not easy to do. Now that I'm a published author and I'm working on book 2, which is spying in college football, I find it much, much easier to be able to get these interviews because I've already established a lot of relationships now, and I'm published, and people are like, oh, okay, this kid's legit now.
Mm-hmm.
So, before he was just some random dude asking for an interview,
right?
Which, I called up I remember calling up an athletic director for the college book before I was published, and I was like, hey, I'd like to interview your head coach. And he's like, okay, who are you and what have you done? And I'm like, well, I'm not published yet, but I hope to be. And it was, that was the end of that conversation. And now it's like, hey, I'm published, and I've been interviewed by, ESPN Radio and CBS TV, and and now, I just
now they'll fly you out.
Yeah, I was asking to be interviewed by Orlando Franklin on his. He's got a show, Orlando and Cecil, out in Denver. I was asking to be interviewed by him, and I get to look at my Twitter, and I've got a message from Orlando Franklin,
nice.
Former Broncos player, like, yeah, we'd love to have you on. And I'm like, man, this is so much nicer. Like,
right.
this is awesome. This is great. So yeah.
Now you'll get athletic directors reaching out to you to be in your next book.
Hey, that'd be nice.
So being that you were a first time author, like if you could go back and do anything differently in terms of trying to secure those interviews or persuade anybody, would you have tried to do something differently? I don't want to ask like, should you have, maybe done another book first in order to make it a little easier to get those interviews? Because obviously this was something that you were passionate about, but was there anything that you think would have helped the process or, ease it up a little bit?
Well, oddly enough, I know when you think of social media, everybody's all about Twitter and Instagram and like Facebook, right? I mean, those are the staples go to. Everybody was just like, yeah, have those accounts and don't worry about anything else. But strangely enough, LinkedIn has been like my go-to on social media. And it's allowed me to connect with so many NFL players, coaches, and then, college guys as well. And so if I had to do it over, I would have started that a lot earlier and tried that route to connect with people, because I find, they're very willing to engage on LinkedIn, almost, I guess, because it's a professional setting. And it's, me as a professional coming to you as a professional and asking, for a professional interview. And so I would have tried to tap into that a lot more if I had to do it all again, and knowing what I know now. But writing a book, there's so many lessons I learned that you just don't know till you jump in there and you try to do it and find out what works. And and I got so much great advice along the way from agents, literary agents, and then the publisher. And it's a steep learning curve for your first book, is the reality of it.
Whenever you were pitching the idea to agents and publishing houses, did they confuse the topic at all with espionage and cheating? Because you in the book, obviously, you mentioned how there are legitimate methods to conduct espionage, like advanced scouting, and then there's the illicit ways. So whenever
Yeah.
they first saw the title, or you were telling them, did they think it was going to be a book about cheating, or did they know from the get-go that this was going to be, a combination of, legal methods and illegal methods?
Yeah, so I mean, even at probably every third podcast I do, it's still like I'm having that conversation of, hey, this isn't. I'm not just talking about all the illicit methods, like we know Spygate, we know Deflategate, right?
Right.
It's not just that. There's so many things that are either permissible, they're completely permitted by the NFL, by the rules and the bylaws. And then I also get into the book, a lot of stuff that's questionable. It's permitted, but is it ethical? And do teams feel comfortable doing it? Like using lip reading, for example. All those coaches, they hold up those play sheets to cover their mouth
Yeah.
now, right? But you're going to have a lot of coaches that say, yeah, that's a really underhanded tactic to be able to use. So I try to cover, or elicitation. Like I got an example in my book of Peyton Manning going to the Pro Bowl and trying to feed fellow Pro Bowlers Mai Tai drinks to get them a little intoxicated and to get them, get them talking about, their team secrets. Is that permissible? Sure. There's no rule against it. Is it a little sneaky and underhanded? Yeah. But, I mean, that's the NFL. So I go the full gamut of all that range of stuff, I think. And so, yeah, absolutely. It was tough to get sometimes to get people to understand where I was going with it. And, the reality is when you're submitting a proposal, especially to agents, a query letter, it's one page. So it's a lot of stuff. You got to tell them, all about you and all about your book in one page. And it can be very difficult. You spend a lot of time crafting it, man. I mean, I don't know how much time I spent revising that thing, but it was probably about as much time as I spent writing a chapter of the book, because you're fine tuning that thing to the nth degree. Because the reality is, when you're trying to like publish a sports book, there are only so many agents that are taking a look at that, right? There's probably 40 or 50 agents total out there that are considering sports books. And if you don't land one of them, you're done. Like, that's it. There's nowhere else to go except for to self-publish at that point.
Why is it so niche?
I mean, it's not, but it's just very, there's only so many guys out there. I mean, so these guys, they don't make huge commissions. So you talk about one sports agent,
Mm-hmm.
And he's going to take a very minimal cut of your book. I mean, he takes 2% of your sales. So how much does that, how many sales does he have to earn to make a living?
Sure.
So he has to have a ton of books out there that he represents, a bunch of authors that he represents, to be able to make a decent living. So you're going to get a lot of the same people representing, 20, 30, 40, 50 books. And that's how it goes. And there's just so many sports books out there. There's just not an infinite number. So.
Yeah, well, like I mentioned earlier, as I was reading the book, it kind of transformed my opinion of it a little more to being from Dan Day to like Paul Zimmerman, because whenever you do get into the scouting of it all, about how teams really notice tendencies, like when Terrell Davis or Terrell Owens would, tuck his gloves, and they would know that he was going out for a pass, or if receivers, go bursting out of the huddle, it's probably going to be a pass, where if they're, very lackadaisical, it's probably going to be a run, those little tell signs. And that was interesting, because in a way that A Thinking Man's Guide to Pro Football taught me a lot about certain aspects of a coach's approach or psychology, but without making it like a tutorial of a how-to. I think you did that with scouting. So was that for you something that you wanted to balance out, where you didn't want to make it, a coaching book about scouting or anything like that, but to offer unique perspective as to what they do and how they approach their job?
Yeah, it was a fine line. I didn't want to just try to make this a uh, sensational book in the aspect of,
Hmm.
here are all your dirty little, here's all the dirty little things, because at the end of the day, a lot of this stuff is just permissible, and I don't want to exaggerate it. I don't want to try to blow it up and make it something it's not, and all this kind of stuff. There's also just so many stories. Like I said, I had to work. I worked for 8 years finding enough material to flesh out this book because it's a very secretive subject. So, for every story that is in that book, there are 15 or 20 probably that have been hidden and will never come out in the light of day. So, trying to find those few that are available, man, it was not easy. It was really hard to do. So, and that's another reason, if I just went for all the clandestine types of activity that went out there, there's just not enough stories to make a whole book out of it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a reason. But I also think it's really interesting, not going into everything that's permissible, everything that's questionable, and then more so, what are the countermeasures that teams use to defend against all of this stuff, which I personally find just as interesting a subject as all of the collection efforts. Because, a guy like Peyton Manning, okay, so he goes and tries to get the guys intoxicated to collect on them. But at the same time, he's a guy who, when he's with the Broncos, has them stop the bus on the way to the Patriots stadium where the Broncos were going to practice, and says, you know what? Instead of doing our walkthrough practice at their stadium, let's do our walkthrough in the woods. And leads them on this hike through the woods to this open area because he's like, yeah, someone's going to be spying on us there. So, and that may sound absolutely insane and crazy, but you know what? It's the teams that take that seriously enough to be that paranoid. Those are the guys that are winning championships and Super Bowls. And I'll tell you right now, you think of the teams that are perennially turning out really bad or not great teams, those are the same teams that are not doing all the little things. So it may sound like absolutely paranoid to be looking on film to see who's adjusting gloves like this, like Terrell Owens did, or to be holding practices in the woods. But who's winning Super Bowls? It's the Peyton Mannings that are trying to get players intoxicated, that are pulling guys out into the woods, that are doing everything, little thing extra to get that advantage. And those are the guys and the teams that are winning championships, plain and simple.
And it seems like the guy that he would lose most often to is the coach that excels at this stuff better than anyone.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly it. And that's one of the things I go into the book, and I think it really highlights how many big games, how many championships have really had a huge, huge impact from teams collecting and getting that advantage. And, and in the military, we call it a force multiplier, all that information you gather. And that's what it is. The Patriots may be better than the Colts may be better than the Patriots, when they play. But if the Patriots can gather that little bit of information that gives them the advantage, guess what? That can tip the scales and put get them the advantage and put them in, give them the chance that they need to win the game. And it's critical, especially in today's NFL, where the league is built around parity because of the way the draft is done and because of the salary cap. Teams need that advantage, and the teams that are winning are the ones that are able to collect, assimilate that information better than others, and protect their own information as well.
Well, it also seems from a psychological standpoint that the sort of I know that you know that I know philosophy, that illusion even can create like this distraction that takes the team Like that almost makes the team forget that there's a game to be played on the field. Like when you're talking about, Peyton Manning has to bring in his receivers into the showers of Gillette Stadium and put the showers on and whisper so, he's worried that the room is bugged or something. Stuff like that I think can kind of break focus for a lot of teams because they get so paranoid that someone's watching or someone's listening that perhaps they even forget to focus on the things they have to do on the field and the play itself.
Yeah, that's exactly it, Aaron. I mean, if you look at a team's schedule, it's very regimented, and there's very little time for anything out of the ordinary. Pretty much every minute of every day is accounted for these guys, right? Mm-hmm. Especially for the coaching staff. So if you play a team that you're worried about all these different types of collection, and that may be the Patriots today, but that's changed over time, and that's I mean, George Halas with the Bears was big on this, Vince Lombardi back in the day, Sid Gillman with the Chargers. There's a whole laundry list of coaches that have been willing to, go out of the way and have been very, very good at collecting information on other teams. And so, yeah, where the heck was I going with this, Aaron? I don't know.
Well, that's actually a good point to my next question was, there seems to me when I was reading the book, like recurring characters, whether it's Belichick, Al Davis, Sid Gillman, Halas, were these guys that you knew you wanted to incorporate in the book, or was it something that the more information you found out, the more recurring characters that came in, you really knew who to focus on? Because and this wasn't something I necessarily had thought of before, but when you talk about all these guys, there really is a certain personality type that they all fit into, and that can really explain why they're all great coaches. Is that they're so deliberately, they have such a deliberate attention to detail, and they really will resort to any out of the box method to gain that advantage.
Yeah, so that's an really interesting question. So if you look at, there are, obviously we all know about coaching trees, right? Mm-hmm. But I would say likewise, one of the things that has impacted coaches is who they have been assistants for in the past when it comes to, seeing how other coaches go about gathering and protecting information. So I'll give you an example. So like Sid Gillman, okay? So guess who one of his assistants was? Al Davis. Right? And then, you take a guy like Al Davis, who was assistant under him, Mike Shanahan. And he was pretty involved in all this stuff. Mm-hmm. And who absolutely loved Al Davis and was interviewed by Al Davis to be his, defensive coordinator at one point, Bill Belichick. So, you look at these trees, and these guys are learning this stuff from other coaches. So that absolutely comes into play. I think it has a very big effect on, on their development. And it absolutely, I didn't set out to write about these guys. It was one of those things when I was going through the research of the book, some names just keep popping up over and over again because they're doing so much different stuff. Or even, you start a name for yourself and you just become suspected of everything. And that's where Belichick is these days, right? So, Spygate went on, Deflategate went on. Well, now he does everything. No one really knows, but absolutely, he's involved in everything.
Right.
He's involved in listening devices in the locker room, like Peyton Manning was worried about. Is he? Probably not. I don't know. But the fear is there. And that is something, Belichick's never going to deny that. Al Davis was accused of that, and he just laughed. When a reporter asked him that question, he just said, "Well, I'll tell you one thing. The listening device wouldn't be up in the ceiling. And he just left it at that because he wants to give that illusion that, yeah, I'm willing to go there. Because other teams have to worry about that. Then they have to drag wide receivers into the shower room to talk. They have to whisper. They have to say, oh, you know what? We can't even give our pregame strategy in the locker room. We're going to have to do this on the bus or somewhere else, or not do it all together. And that, it affects the team. those are routines, and every single player and coach loves those routines, and they thrive off them. And when you make another team change it, it impacts them. And when you make another team plan for it, it takes time out of their schedule. Okay, coach, how are we going to deal with this? Okay, if we think the other teams, like the Patriots have been accused of, if we think maybe they're stealing play sheets out of the locker room, are we going to have to leave people behind to deal with that? If we think there's listening devices in the locker room, how are we going to deal with that? If they think they're spying on our practices, what are we going to deal with that? Man, those are big questions that consume a lot of time and take a lot of planning. And it detracts from something. It detracts from the time they have to game plan against Tom Brady or Bill Belichick, the best coach or the best quarterback in the NFL. Obviously, Brady's not there anymore, but those are the type of things, that teams have to deal with when, just dealing with the ordinary Patriots is a monumental task.
Well, even in the book, you mentioned how, because you were talking about how, you're not even going to trust to go over a game plan in a locker room. You want to do it on the bus. But in your book, you bring up how someone tried to sneak on a bus. I think it was with Weeb Eubank with the Jets. So he stopped and had the guy kicked off. I don't remember who the player was. But just attempts like those will show you that there's no method that's out of the realm of possibility to at least try. And the best example was when you were talking about, I think Sid Gilman suspected, or maybe he had a woman pushing a baby stroller, and supposedly there was a dwarf inside used to take pictures of the formations of the opponent that week.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head, Aaron. I mean, teams really are willing to go to anything. I mean, there's stories in the book of, how a team has used a priest to collect information on other teams. You got the story, like you mentioned, of a dwarf, little person being pushed in a stroller, allegedly, holding a video camera to record a practice. That was with the Rams, allegedly, using that tactic back in the day. But there's so many things that teams are willing to do. I mean, they just, I think one of the really interesting things is most teams don't have a professional information collector. They've got a lot of guys. They have usually an NFL. They'll have a security guy on their team who is, usually a former FBI guy who knows a little bit at least about protecting information and some defensive countermeasures. But a lot of teams don't have anybody who's really, trained to gather information. And so a lot of times it's just left up to the coaches and their imaginations. And if someone, who's, made a living gathering and protecting information, it's really interesting to me, seeing, really a bunch of amateurs, although they're, they can be very good at some of their stuff like film study, right? I mean, they're amazing at doing that level of stuff. But when it comes to trying to think of some, super spook spy techniques and whatnot, it's, at times it's just really funny because they make a hot mess of it, which I think the book is full of some really funny stories. Yeah. Because they are amateurs. And then at other times, they do a great job of it, thinking outside the box, because let's face it, you don't need to be a spy or a super spook to have some good creative ideas on how you can collect information about other people. Wives and women have been doing that, since the beginning of time. So, I mean, so it's, I think the book's a lot of fun. It's got a lot of, really, really great, interesting stories that I was very happy to be able to capture.
Well, you would think too, especially back in the 60s, that a lot of the scouts who were doing, or the coaches too, who were doing that kind of thing had come from a war background from World War II. So they might have had a little bit more of a sensibility of how to conduct these kind of clandestine missions, if you will, as opposed to maybe what some people would have today.
Yeah, so that's one of the really surprising things, that surprised me when I was doing the book, was just how few teams have a professional collector in there. And so I'll give you an example, like Ron Wolf worked, he was a scout for the Raiders. And during the Cold War, he had worked, he was a spy more or less doing operations in Berlin. And when it came to being able to gather information on the assessments other teams had of prospects, he was able to say, hey, I know, that team, we don't have to worry about him drafting, this player. They're not interested. They don't need that position. And frankly, their rating of this prospect was low. And, he could, he knew the intelligence and assessments of other teams because he was so good at collecting information.
Right.
And so when he was out on the road scouting, he was busy talking to other scouts, not just, he was not just looking at players. He was assessing how other teams thought of those same prospects that he was looking at.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, it gave the Raiders a huge advantage during the draft. And, and Al Davis at the top of his game was one of the premier coaches and general managers. And so, he was really able to take advantage of that. And I think it showed what could be done if you have those professionals. But a lot of times they're just, they're not around. A team like the Patriots now, they've got a guy named Ernie Adams on their staff, who is Belichick's right-hand man, who most NFL fans don't know anything about. And he's probably one of the top 3 or 4 minds in all of professional football. Guy's a football savant. Mm-hmm. And he's been with Bill Belichick since high school. And they've, and he really runs the whole Patriots, collection efforts and all this type of stuff. And so having a guy like that who's got a photographic memory and who's, this is really his job and his duty, this is what he does. And teams that are willing to allocate those type of resources and brains and experience to doing this well, they have a huge advantage. There's a reason the Raiders are winning, were winning championships in the 70s. There's a reason the Patriots are winning championships, up until Tom Brady left. And, who knows how that goes in the future. But, it's not pure dumb luck. And it's not always just having the best players.
I think I read an article one time about Ernie Adams where I don't remember if it was Belichick describing him or one of the players, but they were talking about how he's a guy who really needs to know tendencies. And he goes as far as to know the tendencies of the refs and how frequently they call certain penalties and from what vantage point they are on the field. And, are they more likely to do 50-50 calls, or if it's even a fraction apparent or anything like that, if there's only like a minuscule bit of evidence that there was a penalty there, would they call it? So even down to the referees, Ernie Adams knows, what a ref is likely to call or not. So even stuff like that can be a huge advantage when you're doing like toss-up balls,
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me in the least. I mean, the Patriots are known for finding all the loopholes in the NFL rules. Mm-hmm. We've seen that over and over. I mean, it all gets attributed to Belichick, but I'm sure there's a lot of Ernie Adams in there finding those loopholes as well.
Yeah.
And, I think the thing that the Patriots do better than anyone is not just collecting information, which they do, and they're willing to cross some lines that other teams are not. And I think that's, very evident, and I make that, very clear in the book. But what they also do is, how do you assimilate and use that information? Or how do you use your different types of collection platforms to verify information? Mm-hmm. So, for example, Jimmy Johnson, who was coaching the Cowboys, when everything Spygate came out, he said, during my time in Dallas, we did the exact same thing. We taped other teams, we taped other teams' signals, but we were not able to use that information effectively. And so we just stopped doing it. But Belichick and the Patriots, they know how to use it. And so they're doing stuff like advanced scouting. So you take those signals that you learn about, and then you have your advanced scouts confirm it or learn it. And then you go back and study film. And once again, you have them do that. And then you debrief players coming in from other teams. Hey, we think this signal corresponds to this play. Is that still true? Yes or no?
Right.
And then they look at, potentially you're looking at stealing paperwork, getting a hold of play sheets, getting a hold of playbooks, all these different methods that can be used to gather that information. And so all of that plays into it. And the teams that collect information effectively don't just rely on one method or one source. They are constantly confirming and assessing, because one method could be wrong. And teams are constantly changing, right? It's a defensive countermeasure. You have to constantly be changing your signals or your audibles or whatever it is, because other teams are going to, in the long run, try to figure those out. So,
well, even just from signing players they had cut.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That's something all NFL teams do. And you either sign a player who has recently been cut from a team, and you add them on to your current roster, sometimes just for the purpose of debriefing him. And then when that week is done and you've played that opponent, those players get cut. Or you sign somebody. If you can't find someone available who you want to sign off that team, then you sign someone from their practice squad. Because if you bring that player up onto your regular roster, you can sign anybody off of another team's practice squad if you're willing to bring them onto your normal 52-man roster.
Right.
52, is that right? I don't know. But whatever the number is. And so, that's constantly done. And that's just a part of the game, and everybody understands that.
Mm-hmm.
And, and these guys that are signed, a lot of times they know that's the only reason they're being brought on, but they're happy to get a paycheck.
Right.
Those guys that are on the bubble of being in the NFL or seeing their careers just vanish, they're more than happy to have at least a weekly paycheck and to have a week to try to prove themselves that, hey, I'm worth more than just the information. I can catch footballs or run the football or whatever it is. They have something to be able to bring to that team, and it's an audition for them.
Yeah. So you mentioned on the bubble, something that I always love, especially as the more I get into football history, is about learning about people who are on the fringe of professional football, who might be not necessarily well known, but they had an impact in one way or another, but you'll never really hear about them. And one guy that I was really interested in reading about was Ed Boynton, who was the security chief for George Allen and the Rams. And it sounds like he was a pioneer in his own right. Could you just tell the audience a little bit about him first before we move on?
Yeah, sure. So, so Ed Boynton was kind of like he was really a jack of all trades, right? So, he got brought in.
I thought you were going to say a Jack Webb.
Well, he was like the first full-time security guy that was ever used. At first with the Rams, and then later with the Redskins as well. And so whenever I'm trying to remember the name of the coach who had him. Do you remember who that was?
George Allen.
Yeah, George Allen. Thank you. So George Allen, he traveled with him wherever he went, and George Allen would get, he would call it his spidey sense. He'd be like, hey, I got a bad feeling about this dude who's up on this roof up there. Ed, can you, go check it out? This is, it's probably a spy up there. So, Ed would go and try to figure out why that guy was up there, and ask him, and, maybe ask him to get down if it needed it. But, coaches are paranoid, and a guy like George Allen, he was one of those guys that was involved in a lot of, questionable techniques.
Right.
So, he's paranoid. If there's a guy climbing up a telephone pole, he's thinking, guess what? That's probably a spy, and it's not a coincidence. He's wondering that, because These are the type of things that those coaches that are willing to, exceed the bounds of propriety and the rule book, they're willing to go to these means. So they're absolutely paranoid on all this little stuff. And Ed Boynton was, he was one of those first guys to look into it. And I think one of the funniest stories with him was he was so dedicated to his job that he would even review film of the sidelines, trying to figure out if there was someone there who didn't belong. Because teams have used reporters in the past, or photographers that like roam the sidelines, that go back to the other side of the field and bring information to the coach on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
And my book's got a few examples of that taking place in the past. So, a guy like Ed Boynton, he's checking out the film, trying to see if this type of stuff is happening, And at one point he identifies someone and he's like, who's that dude? And he's reviewing the film. He's like, I can't figure it out. Who is this guy? I got to figure it. And then he's like, oh, that's me. I was the one lurking back there, looking like a spy because basically I am. And that's, but that just gives you an idea of, the level of paranoia and dedication that teams have to this. I mean, think about how boring just being a player reviewing film is probably. Coaches spend, endless hours doing this. But if you're reviewing security footage, oh my gosh, talk
just
about a
looking
job
at a
that'll
sideline,
right? But that's how dedicated these guys are to their craft and how important it can be, because these guys catch spies, from other teams. And there's quite a few examples in the book of guys catching people trying to sneak through practice gates with cameras in hand, and that type of stuff, because that absolutely, it goes on. And that's why you have these security guys doing their job and trying to catch them.
Now, what about the NFL security personnel? At the headquarters level, from NFL headquarters. I mean, do they play any role in doing stuff like that, where they'll try to see if a team is trying to spy on someone else, or if they suspect they're doing it illicitly, or will they look to make sure that there's still a competitive fairness in looking at players who are on, or people who are on sidelines, to make sure no one's doing that, or even looking at other leagues? I mean, obviously we touched base earlier about the AFL, NFL, operation hand-holding and the babysitters and stuff like that we can go into. But did you get any sense of how involved the NFL security department was with this?
Yeah. So bottom line, not very, if at all. So each team has one NFL security representative at a minimum. For most teams, it's just one. And really, they're more about trying to deal with issues quietly when it comes to that local police force. Or if big incidences pop up on a team, like a player gets arrested.
Mm-hmm.
How do we deal with all this? Trying to prevent an issue like Deshaun Watson, this type of thing from coming to light.
Sure.
Because if it does, right, how much does that hurt the NFL's image?
Yeah.
An action like Spygate, taking a knee for the national anthem, Deshaun Watson, it's cost the NFL hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars for every single incident like this. So, that is their main focus, is protecting that bottom line and dealing with that. Making sure that the game is not influenced by betting is probably the major concern of NFL security. Because if it comes out that a player is throwing a game or shaving points in order to try to benefit financially from this, it calls into question the credibility of the game. And the NFL, above all, wants to portray the image that all the games are absolutely 100% fair, and that there are no shenanigans going on that will impact the outcome of a game, that it is the game of football and that is it. Even when that's not the case. So if you take Spygate and Deflategate, for example, and the punishments and the statements that came out of that, neither Roger Goodell or any member of the upper NFL, staff there at NFL headquarters ever made any statement that these type of activities impacted the game. And as a matter of fact, they went out of their way to say, we have no proof whatsoever that whatever happened had any meaningful impact on a game.
Mm-hmm.
Even though we know that's not true. Take Deflategate, for example. If you think about when you're a kid throwing around a football, and the bigger that football is, right, the harder it is to throw. And the harder that football is, the tougher it is to catch. That's why we all love a Nerf football, right? Because It's small and it's soft, and you can chuck that thing for 60 yards and look like a stud, right? And guess what? That's what Tom Brady wanted too. It's not, it's not rocket science that, having a smaller football that's underinflated, it helps. But the NFL is never willing to admit that. And so it's all about protecting that image, what it comes down to. And by and large, the NFL is very reluctant to get involved in anything when it comes to the spying game. I mean, Spygate, for example, they issued 2 memos to the Patriots, to the league as a whole, when other teams had brought up to the NFL that, hey, these guys are videotaping our signals. The Jets weren't the first one to bring that up. And the NFL wasn't willing to do anything other than send a memo. And then would the NFL ever had done anything if the Jets hadn't literally forced the NFL to take action by literally taking into custody the member of the Patriot staff that was recording the signals?
Matt Walsh,
right? I don't know. That may have never come to come to light, or at least it would have been later down the road if the Jets hadn't forced the NFL's hand, because the NFL doesn't want to deal with that because it brings bad publicity on them.
Well, and you got to wonder what was going through Belichick's mind to try to do that against one of his former assistants. And so I'm kind of curious, we're talking about countermeasures throughout the book. What countermeasure do you think Belichick could take so that other, former personnel or employees or coaches don't blow the whistle on what he was doing? NDAs, I guess.
Non-disclosure agreement. And that's standard with all the teams, so that prevents them from talking about the techniques that go on there. But the bottom line is there are very few secrets like that in the NFL when it comes to how teams operate, because everyone wants to implement what they like on their own team, right? So any good ideas are going to become standard policy throughout the NFL pretty quickly.
Yeah.
When it comes down to it. Really, Belichick showed a lot of arrogance in deciding to go ahead and trying to gather that information on a team that had one of his former assistant coaches and knew exactly what he was doing. And but he went ahead and tried to do it anyway. And there's obviously a lot of I think he probably would have been better off just trying to skip that team and saying, you know what, let's not do it against them,
right.
or let's try to gather the same information via a different technique. But when you've won a lot of Super Bowls and you've had a lot of success doing it, we're all creatures of habit, and and I'm sure that's a decision he would love to have back.
Sure.
But we all make bad decisions at one point of our life, and he's a busy guy, so that's probably one of those that he's like, I should have spent a little more time thinking about that one, and I didn't. But that's life, and I'm sure he's moved on.
Have you gotten a lot of heat from Patriots fans since the book came out?
I haven't yet. I'm waiting for it, but
yeah, because the last fourth of the book, I guess, or part 4, I should say, is dedicated towards them as a sole topic and going through the allegations from Spygate going on since 2000, and then Deflategate, and even the Super Bowl that Mike Martz had commented on them knowing, I guess, the plays or watch the practices.
Yeah, so I spoke to Brian O'Leary,
mm-hmm.
Who was the author of Spygate, and I talked to him about all his just experiences, and I could tell he was very I could tell he had taken a beating. He didn't want to say too much about all of it, but I could tell he'd definitely taken a beating. So I was kind of prepared for it. I think a lot of time's gone by, since everything. Spygate was obviously the big one that
Sure.
Everyone was like, everyone had very strong opinions, and somewhat rightfully so, because the NFL, even to this day, does not have a rule against taping other team signals. They've got a memo what is a memo?
They don't have a
It's
rule.
not. There's no rule, right? So, and that's one of the really interesting. So, Patriots fans can argue that until that memo even came out, which was in 2006, the Ray Anderson memo, that the Patriots didn't do anything wrong. And as a matter of fact, many teams were doing the same thing. And there's stories in my book about how teams had done it in the past and done it very successfully. And you know what? It was legal. So, eventually the Ray Anderson memo went out. The Patriots continued to tape other team signals, and they were, violating a memo. But, violating a memo is not the same thing as violating a rule.
Right.
But, ultimately it's the NFL commissioner who makes his own rules to an extent, right? He just decides what's punishable. And the NFL has a lot of, basically fair play. They've got like a fair play rule, which more or less is like, hey, we expect you to act in a way that is professional and becoming and in the best interests of the NFL and to act in an ethical manner, et cetera, which basically means act well or we can punish you. And it's kind of a catch-all.
Yeah.
So the NFL really has way less rules than you would think they do about this type of subject. And, if they need to punish somebody for something like spying on another team's practice, it's not because they have a rule on spying on another team's practice for the most part. It's just going to be, hey, we don't like the way you're acting. It put the NFL in a negative light. It wasn't, fair to the other teams. And so Roger Goodell is going to come up with a punishment with the aid of his lawyers. And there we go. And that's what it is. And that's by and large how the NFL operates.
Now, given that you have gone into so many different directions in the book and looking at these intelligence gathering methods, what were some of the ones that were most intriguing for you to learn about?
So I really loved elicitation, just because I think it's a really fun one, and elicitation is really the art just of trying to gather information by talking to someone without them necessarily know that you're trying to collect information on them. So, I think there's some, obviously there's the one with Peyton Manning trying to get, players intoxicated, but, Al Davis was the master of this technique. And so, there's stories in there of him allegedly calling up another team at halftime and pretending to be the owner of the team. So he's, calls up, hey, I need to talk to Coach so-and-so. And, Coach gets on the line. He's like, and so he's trying, the other team's playing against his Raiders, and he's trying to pretend like the owner of the other team so he can get the, the secrets about, hey, what are we going to do? What are we going to change at the half? What are we going to do different? How are we going to react to this? And, or dressing up, I thought that was, how they spy. I thought dressing up as reporters, there's a couple of great examples of that in the book.
Involving Al Davis.
One with Al Davis. Yeah, one was Al Davis, and he dressed up, went into another team's locker room as a reporter, and asked the player, "Hey, what's the toughest thing for you to defend against?" And so the player gets out, a piece of chalk or a marker and starts diagramming it on the board. He's like, "Oh, I hate it when the other team does this," and Al Davis is just taking down notes, and writing it all down, and but Paul Brown, who was, the first coach of the Cleveland Browns, he was using this tactic a long time ago, dressing up, having members of his staff pretend to be reporters and sending them to the practices of other teams. And that's one of the reasons why teams are so paranoid about having members of the media watch their practices, because teams have been slipping spies in there since, since pretty much professional football has been around. So, it just goes to show, like, this stuff's been going on forever. There's a lot of fun, creative tactics out there, and it's really just a matter of, you can try to limit teams doing certain things, but it all evolves and it changes and it adjusts. And I think that's one of the funnest things to be able to see and look at in the book is, stuff like, okay, teams go to indoor practice facilities for, for example, to try to hide, so other teams can't watch their practices, or at the very least, or move their practice facilities to somewhere that's in the middle of nowhere, like the Redskins and George Allen did with Douglasville. But today, you have drones out there that can be used to potentially, spy on another team's practices. Instead of teams stealing their, regular old playbook, it's all gone digital now. But of course, just like information can be stolen off of your computer, if you got the right, hackers out there going after it, the same stuff can be done in the NFL. So it's a cat and mouse game. It's constantly changing and evolving. And I think that's what makes the subject so neat and so cool is the evolution of not just the game itself by the rules and how it changes by different techniques and what works the best, but that changes the spying in football too. And I think that's really neat to watch both kind of go hand in hand. As one evolves, the other evolves as well.
So you think that the future of espionage in the NFL could become more technologically focused as opposed to physical surveillance or, sweeping rooms for physical copies and anything like that?
Well, it will have, yes. However, having said that, there is always a place for the traditional methodologies that teams use to gather and collect information. It would always be beneficial to have a spy inside of another team, to recruit a member of another team to provide you information, which is a topic that I have a whole chapter about in the book. That's just too valuable to go away. Spying on another team's practice, having a physical set of eyes out there, it's always a possibility. It's always going to be beneficial, and sometimes that's just like walkthrough practices where both teams, let's say before a playoff game or before a Super Bowl, where they're sharing a facility, trying to leave a guy behind to watch what the other team is doing, which the Patriots did before the Rams Super Bowl. The Patriots-Rams Super Bowl. Yeah, that's something those type of tactics, they're not going anywhere. Mm-hmm. They're not going anywhere. But there'll be new ones that absolutely come into play. And so, yeah, it's going to be more digital. That's going to be more of a concern. It's how do you protect that information? I talked to a drone expert who was telling me, he could absolutely, he's like, I could take a drone and fly it over a team's practice and they would have no clue it was there. Like, there's not even a chance. Like, it's just not going to happen. There's too many ways to be able to conceal it. The stuff that you can, the drones today that you can buy with just slight modifications, off the shelf stuff. He's like, for a few $100, no way. He's like, I could land it there at the facility and tape all kinds of stuff. And a matter of fact, you could suck information if they connect their playbooks, their tablets, and have their playbooks on those tablets and are Wi-Fi connected. I could suck all that off too. I could have their whole playbook. Wouldn't even be a problem. It's like, that'd be, simple as can be. And that's all with just off the shelf stuff. Yeah. You're not talking any super spy stuff right there. So absolutely. Talk about big concerns. So teams absolutely have to be aware about that. And the good teams that are winning championships, they're going to be. And the teams that aren't, they're going to get they're going to have their pocket picked and not even have any clue that it's been done. And that's a big part.
Have you ever seen like the digital pickpocketing app that you can do to take off someone's like electronic signal from their credit card to get the number?
Yeah, I haven't seen it, but I've read all about it, and yeah.
Imagine doing that to someone's phone where they have like their playbook in there or something like that, or so where they can access it at least.
Yeah, it's very, all this off the stuff shelf, that is out there. I interviewed a guy who is a technical surveillance countermeasures expert, which is more or less, a guy that is trained to detect, listening devices, mm-hmm. and or hidden cameras. And I was talking to him about that, and he's like, "Yeah, there's these things like a plug for your phone that are embedded with software so that, it introduces spyware. So that once your phone is plugged into this charger, right? After that, it has this malware in there and it can be turned on remotely. So for example, if you can plant this, if you can have a person use this and switch it out with what is being used at a team's facility, it can infect one or more phones that is being, utilized to charge. And then if that guy brings that phone into the locker room or into team meetings, it can be activated remotely and another team can be listening in on all of the conversations that are going on and taking place. So if you don't have experts that are watching out for all of this type of stuff, man, I mean, yeah, you can end up with huge advantages off this type of stuff. And and trying to track down and prove what happened and when it happened and who is responsible and all of this stuff. Other teams are going to cover their steps. And so, teams have to be wary. They have to assume the worst, even when it comes to things that are illegal, breaking laws. In college football, it's been known that a listening device was used on another team. That is illegal. It has still been done. So you can't just say, oh, teams wouldn't go to this extent because it's against the law.
Right.
Yeah. This is we're talking billions, tens of billions of dollars on the line. They're
People will break the law.
They're willing to cross thresholds.
Yeah, I thought that, interrupting radio frequencies for a quarterback or a linebacker's helmet was pretty high tech enough, but what you're talking about just seems like it's a whole new ball game.
Yeah, I mean, potentially, and those are the questions that exist. So there's so many things, and I think that's what's the interesting part of the book is, I can't confirm that everything, that you can dream of and that experts say you should be scared of, and that coaches in the NFL are worried about and keep them up at night. I can't confirm that they're all being used.
Right.
But they can be. And teams have to and do take countermeasures to protect against these techniques, because if they don't and they are used, it's lights out.
Yeah.
Game's over. The other team just won.
Is the college football book that you're writing like the same territory, or is there going to be like a new wrinkle from Spies on the Sideline?
It is, but there's quite a few new wrinkles because of the rules that are different between college football and the NFL. So I'll give you an example. Advanced scouting doesn't take place in college football by and large. There's some room for exceptions to take place, but what that means is, so if you want to, let's say, learn another team's, you want to steal signals.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's one of the prime times to do it, is you send advanced scouts there that try to learn the signals that, all the cards that teams hold up, or the hand signals that quarterbacks flash to call an audible. Those are all things that advanced scouts look at and try to figure out while that team is playing their opponents, their upcoming opponents. So if you can't do that in college football, what do? Well, you rely on other techniques, or you break rules and send people anyway. But who do you send, right? You can't really send members of your coaching staff, which has happened and has created quite a few scandals in the past. And that'll be on Frontline. If you're a member of another coaching staff and you're seen at another team's games like that, that's in the press. It's going to be front page news.
Right.
So what can you do? Well, you can send a player of your team because they're not forbidden to go, and they do. You can send boosters to bring back information. So the techniques are very different. So it all differs in how it can be collected. And then in Spies on the Sidelines, I go into the NFL draft, how teams assess prospects, how they assess how other teams evaluate prospects.
Mm-hmm.
But in college football, it's all about it's all about obviously, recruiting, right? And that's so different. And then you have everything now with the, names, images, and likeness on how that affects recruiting, as well as the one-time transfer rule, which is looking like it's going to go to the unlimited transfer rule. So what you have there is now teams are not just worried about recruiting a player once and we're going to have them on our team for 4 years, right? Because if, let's say, Arizona State has a stud cornerback who's good enough to go play for anybody, guess what? Alabama, Georgia, Ohio State, they're all going to come calling on that player between his freshman and sophomore year, or whenever he shows that he's a stud.
Right.
And so if, Arizona State wants to keep this guy, they've got to re-recruit this guy year after year after year. And then, there becomes this interesting world out there of what do you got to do to recruit people? And that's an intelligence operation all its own when it comes to recruiting guys and what goes into that. And it is absolutely wild. And frankly, it is more disheartening than anything that I ever found in the NFL.
I can see that.
And some of the stuff that goes on in college football recruiting would just, it turns your stomach.
I think Sports Illustrated 10 years ago I think you mentioned in the book actually about Oklahoma State. I want to say how they were using like, underhanded tactics to recruit players to go to the university. It was supposed to be like this big expose about, corruption in college football. I don't remember what the name of the exact article was, but it was like a 5-part series, maybe 4-part. But yeah, it's like, and there's been obviously books written about that too, but that seems like it'd be a timely book, especially with the new NIL rules that are in place.
Yeah, well, for Spies on the Sidelines, one of the topics I was really interested to find more information about, but wasn't really able to. And there's a few of those, right? I would have, and I've had some more luck when it comes to the college football, and so that's why I think it's that book's going to be a little different and have some interesting wrinkles that I wasn't able to reveal in Spies on the Sidelines. But one of those topics I wanted to get into was the use of attractive females to try to gather information. Because let's face it, when it comes to international espionage, right, that's the oldest trick in the book.
Right.
We call it it's a honeypot, or
the femme fatale.
Right. So, and you alluded to it. I mentioned how, in college football, it had been used in the past, by a reporter wanting to get more information and pretending to be, someone else, and developed a relationship with a college football player, for the purposes of trying to gather information about how drugs were being, used by a team at large. But same deal. Attractive female, it can be used for the same thing, gathering more, more information that is out there. And that's just, that's one of the tactics that I'm sure absolutely teams use. I'm sure they use, if players are going out drinking, if I was in charge of head, security guy of the team, I'd be warned, hey, other teams, opponents are going to put attractive females in front of you. And, because, players, playbooks have gone missing. They spend the night with a female and then playbooks go missing. That's been known to happen. So if you think that's, just at random, that's an operation. Yeah. That's a well planned out operation targeting these guys. And that's the type of stuff that absolutely 100% goes down. And, you can't always find as much information as you would like on all of these topics because it's secretive. Teams don't want to reveal it.
Feels like for that, you would also need to find like a Rolodex from a coach that would have resorted to that kind of tactic. Of names to call.
Right. And who's going to want to reveal that?
Right.
Who's going to want to taint their legacy? And sometimes coaches are gone long enough that they're willing to go into that. But if you think Bill Belichick's going to write a memoir on all the strategies he used that were illicit to gather information. It ain't happening. These guys that are winning 6, 7 Super Bowls aren't tainting their legacies and coming out with, oh, here's all the ways I cheated to be able to attain greatness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not happening.
No.
Unless Peyton Manning gets them drunk and they just start writing a book.
But there we go. There's our hope. Let's do it, Peyton.
Yeah, man. Do you want to tell everyone where they can get the book, Kevin?
Yeah, so you can go to my, it's on Amazon, first of all. You can find it there. You can also go to my website, spiesonthesidelines.com, and it has all the different ways you can buy the book out there. I will say there's a cheaper way than Amazon. If you buy through the publisher, Rowman and Littlefield, which I've got the link on my website, and enter the promotion code that I've got there, you can get 30% off the hardcover book. So, the book's out in hardback, in ebook, and also audiobook. The audiobook's not out on Amazon, but I've got lots of other ways that you can grab it. I will say the audiobook is half the price of all the others. So if you're looking to save the money, the audiobook is the way to go. I'm also going to give away for the month, at least the month of August and September. I'm looking at giving away 4 different copies of the audiobook, and all you got to do is follow me on Instagram or Twitter to be able to I'm just gonna randomly select a person, and I'll direct message them and say you're the winner and here's your code to be able to use that. So my Instagram and all my handles are on my webpage. You can find it, but I'll give out my Instagram and Twitter one for anybody who wants to copy it down. My Instagram is at kevinbryant.author. So kevinbryant.author. And my Twitter is at Kev, just K-E-V, Bryant author. So at Kev Bryant author. Yeah. And, get a chance to get a free book. And even if you buy a regular version, you give it to a buddy, give it to a family member. Makes a great gift. So yeah.
Yeah, well, as someone who finished reading the book yesterday, I can definitely add a testament to that it's definitely a unique book, one of a kind. It's not a topic that you're going to find a lot, if anything, written on, and you did a magnificent job of really bringing in a lot of stories together and really breaking down. I mean, I mentioned it, I guess, 2 or 3 times now, but it's more than just, a clandestine secret agent operative kind of book that people might get when they look at it. It's really also a look about scouting and about breaking down film and how coaches utilize everything at their disposal to find a competitive edge. So I'm really glad that you took the time to come on, and I hope the conversation was as fun for you as it was for me, because I love this kind of stuff, and everything in this book I think was long.